Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 16th of September 2021 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today have been presented on the screen. Time-stepping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. Continuing with our weekly series of mains assignment questions from the Daily News Simplified videos, the question for this particular week here is, critically analyze the ways in which India-Russia relationship is changing the emerging geopolitical scenario. The answer to this particular question has to be written in 250 words. Before writing the answer to this particular question, I suggest you to go through the DNS dated 20th of April 2021. Those of you who would be able to submit the answers by the end of Saturday, your answers will be evaluated by the teachers of RAU'S IAS. All the best. Now, this particular article appears on page number 1. The title of the article is Lifeline for the Telecom Companies as the government offers 4-year moratorium on dues. See, in October 2019, the Supreme Court of India had delivered a landmark verdict as to what constitutes the adjusted gross revenue in the telecommunication sector. Because of this Supreme Court order, the telecom operators in case of India had to pay approximately around 1.5 lakh crores in the form of dues to the central government. So this Supreme Court order had adversely affected the financial position of the telecom operators. Hence, in order to ease the burden on the telecom operators, now the government of India has introduced the reform package. So from the perspective of the prelims examination, one should be aware about the concept of the adjusted gross revenue in the telecommunication sector, as well as the concept of the Universal Service Obligation Fund. And as far as the mains examination is concerned, one should be aware about the present status of the telecommunication sector, the government initiatives, and various challenges faced by the telecom operators. Now, based upon our discussion of these aspects of the article, you should be in a position to attempt these 3 prelims questions for the practice. Apart from that, you should also be in a position to write an answer to this mains question for the practice. The question here is, what do you think are the major constraints and challenges faced by the telecom sector in India? How do the recent reform measures address these concerns? So before discussing as to what are the recent reform measures introduced by the government, let me first discuss the background to this particular issue. Now, in the field of the telecommunication sector, the concept of adjusted gross revenue is extremely important. This is so because based upon the adjusted gross revenue of a particular telecom operator, a telecom operator would be required to pay various kinds of fees to the central government. For example, 3% of the AGR should have to be paid in the form of licensing fee, 3% in the form of the spectrum usage charge, and 5% in the form of the contribution to the Universal Service Obligation Fund. The Universal Service Obligation Fund, it has been given the statutory status under the Indian Telegraph Act. So whatever is the adjusted gross revenue of a particular telecom operator, out of that 5% has to be contributed to the Universal Service Obligation Fund, and the money which is lying in this particular fund is in turn used to improve the tele-density in the rural and remote areas. That is, basically it is used to improve the telephone connection and mobile connection in the rural and remote areas. Now, the crux of the issue which had arisen between the government and the telecom operator was over how this adjusted gross revenue should be calculated. Now, if you look at the way the telecom operators earn revenue, the revenue as such can be considered to be a core revenue and the non-core revenue. When we say core revenue, it is basically the revenue which the telecom operators earn from its core activities, which obviously include the provision of cellular services as well as data services. Apart from earning revenue from these 2 sources, some of the telecom operators also earn revenue from certain non-core activities. Now, these non-core activities include the sale of the mobile handsets, sale of the assets which they have, or say the interest which they earn on the deposits with the banks. So the revenue which they earn on these activities, it can be considered as the non-core revenue. So the controversy which had arisen between the government and the telecom operator was over how this AGR should be calculated. Now the government wanted that when we calculate AGR, we should take into account both core activities as well as the non-core activities. On the other hand, the telecom operators wanted that when we calculate the adjusted gross revenue, we should include only the revenue which they earn from the core activities, and the AGR as such should not include the revenue which they earn from the non-core activities. This is quite obvious because if we calculate the adjusted gross revenue according to the government's argument, that is if we take into account both core and non-core activities, obviously the AGR would increase, and if the AGR increases, the telecom operators would be required to pay more amount of fees such as the licensing fee, spectrum usage charge, contribution to USOF and so on. So that is why the telecom operators were arguing that the AGR should include only the revenue which they earn from the core activities. So because of the differences in the views between the government and the telecom operators as to what constitutes the adjusted gross revenue, the case then went before the Supreme Court of India. Accordingly, in October 2019, the Supreme Court delivered a landmark verdict, and this Supreme Court verdict was in the favor of the government. The Supreme Court said that when we calculate the adjusted gross revenue, we should take into account the revenue earned by the telecom operators both from the core as well as the non-core activities. Apart from this, the Supreme Court also said that this particular decision would be applicable from the year 2005 onwards. So between the years 2005 to 2019, we would have to calculate the adjusted gross revenue by taking into account the core and non-core activities, and how much ever is the adjusted gross revenue, based upon that we would have to calculate all of these fees, plus we would have to include the penalties as well, and how much ever is the total outstanding charge, that outstanding charge would have to be paid to the central government. So when the Supreme Court delivered this particular verdict, the total amount of fees plus the penalties which all the telecom operators were required to be paid to the government, this was as high as rupees 1.5 lakh crores. So this particular judgment of the Supreme Court in October 2019, this had an adverse impact on the telecommunication sector in multifaceted manner. For example, first and foremost, it led to their poor financial position because they had to pay a large amount of fees and penalties to the government. Secondly, see, this particular Supreme Court judgment, it was applicable from the year 2005 onwards, whereas some of the telecom operators such as Jio, they had entered the telecom market only in the year 2016. So the Supreme Court judgment had a much higher impact on the older telecom operators such as say Vodafone, and it had less amount of impact on the new telecom operators such as Jio. Now, considering the fact that Jio made an entry into the Indian telecom market only in the year 2016, Jio had to pay the penalties only for a period of 3 years, that is 2016 to 2019. But as far as Vodafone is concerned, it had to pay the penalty right from the year 2005 to 2019. So obviously the penalty which Vodafone was required to pay, this was far higher than the amount of penalty which Jio was required to pay. So this particular Supreme Court judgment in turn led to a higher adverse impact on the older telecom operators and less impact on the new telecom operators. That is why the older telecom operators such as Vodafone, they are in huge amount of losses. Accordingly, some of the experts have pointed out that the Indian telecom sector is slowly moving towards duopoly, which means that in future we may come across only two telecom operators, one being obviously Reliance Jio and the other being Airtel. Other telecom operators such as Vodafone, they may not be in a position to operate because of their poor financial position. Already, as you know, Idea has got merged into Vodafone because of its poor financial position. Nextly, these telecom operators, they have taken huge amount of loans from the banks, and their poor financial position has led to the increase in the non-performing assets of the banks. Nextly, so far we as consumers, we were able to get benefit from the cutthroat competition in the telecommunication sector, wherein both seller charges as well as data charges were quite lower. Now this was possible because of the cutthroat competition. Now going forward, if we come across a duopoly in the telecommunication sector, That means in future, if there are only two telecom operators, then this would have an adverse impact on the consumers, because we as consumers, we would not have more choices with respect to the telecom operators, and these two telecom operators may start hiking or increasing their cellular as well as data charges. And last and most important aspect is, see, India is aspiring to bring in the Industrial Revolution 4.0. The Industrial Revolution 4.0 is based upon new age technologies such as the 5G, the Internet of Things, big data, artificial intelligence, and so on. So if we have to give a push to all of these technologies, we would want the financial position of the telecom operators to be extremely good. Only when the financial position of the telecom operators is good, they would be able to make an investment in the economy, which could in turn usher in the Industrial Revolution 4.0. So poor financial position of the telecom operators can actually create problems for India with respect to the Industrial Revolution 4.0. So it is behind all of these problems which the telecom operators are encountering, the government of India has announced a reform package. So let's look into the important highlights of the reform package announced by the government of India. So coming to the first reform, see, as discussed before, presently the financial position of the telecom operators is quite poor, because of which they are not in a position to pay the dues to the central government. Accordingly, in order to provide the telecom operators with a relief, the central government has announced for a moratorium on payment of dues, which means that the telecom operators need not pay the dues for the next 4 years. But after 4 years, once their financial position improves, whatever dues are outstanding, those dues would have to pay to the central government. So this is done in order to ease the burden on the telecom operators and to improve their financial position. Secondly, as discussed before, presently the government of India considers the adjusted gross revenue to include both core revenue as well as a non-core revenue. Now, in its reform package, the government has announced that henceforth, that is in future, the adjusted gross revenue will include only the core revenue. In future, the non-core revenue will not be considered for the calculation of the adjusted gross revenue. But this particular decision of the government would be applicable only in future. It will not be applicable to the present dues which are required to be paid by the telecom operators. Which means right now whatever dues are calculated, these dues are calculated by taking into account both core and non-core revenue, and that will remain the same. But in future, the AGR will include only the core revenue and it will not include the non-core revenue. Thirdly, see, as discussed before, presently the telecom operators are required to pay 3% of the adjusted gross revenue in the form of the spectrum usage charge. In the reforms which the government has announced, the government has decided to do away with the spectrum usage charge in the future spectrum auctions. That is, in future, the government will not collect the spectrum usage charge from the telecom operators. Nextly, earlier, whenever the government used to allocate the spectrum to a telecom operator, the telecom operator used to get the spectrum for a period of 20 years. Now, this tenure of the spectrum which is made available to a telecom operator, this has got increased to 30 years. The next and most important change is with respect to the FDI in the telecom sector. See, presently, 49% FDI in the telecom sector is allowed through the automatic route. Beyond 49 and up to 100%, FDI is allowed in the telecommunication sector only through the approval route. But now the government has announced that 100% FDI would be allowed in the telecommunication sector under the automatic route, which means that the approval route as such has been done away with in the recent reforms package. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article. As far as this particular question related to USOF is concerned, I have already discussed this as part of my discussion. As far as the question related to PM Vani and the definition of broadband is concerned, please try to find out the answers to these two questions on your own and let us know the answer in the comment section given below. With this, let us now take up the next article. Now, this particular article appears on page number 11. The article is titled as Ola commences the sale of the electric scooter. See, recently two important developments have taken place with respect to electric mobility in India. First and foremost, the Ola company that we know of, it is basically a ride-sharing platform. This Ola company has now diversified itself towards the manufacturing of the electric scooters. Recently, it has decided to set up the Giga factory in the state of Tamil Nadu, whose capacity would be approximately equal to 10 million electric scooters on an annual basis. So clearly, Ola would want to position itself as the future Tesla. So just like how Tesla has become the global leader with respect to manufacturing of electric cars, Ola would want to replicate the same success with respect to the manufacturing of the electric scooters. Secondly, the government of India has made certain important changes to the FAME scheme in order to make the electric mobility more affordable and attractive for the Indian consumers. So, because of these recent developments which have taken place with respect to the electric mobility, the topic of electric mobility would become important both from the perspective of the prelims as well as the mains examination. From the perspective of the prelims examination, one should be aware about the various initiatives taken by the government to push for the electric mobility. As far as the mains examination is concerned, UPSC could ask you a question with respect to three distinct dimensions of the electric mobility. That is, why there is a need to push for electric mobility, what are the challenges, and how these challenges can be addressed. So, based upon the discussion of these topics, you should be in a position to attend these two prelims questions for the practice. Apart from that, you should also be in a position to write an answer to this particular mains question for practice. The question here is, though a step in the right direction, India's push for electric mobility is saddled with multifaceted challenges. Discuss. Now coming to various initiatives which have been taken to boost the electric vehicles. First and foremost, the Ministry for Heavy Industries has launched the National Electric Mobility Mission Plan 2020. Under this particular mission plan, the idea is to create an enabling ecosystem in order to ensure that from the year 2020 onwards, we should be able to sell at least around 6 to 7 million electric vehicles on an annual basis. So this particular mission plan has been formulated by the Ministry for Heavy Industries. Under this particular mission plan, we have set up two institutional mechanisms. Firstly, you have the National Council for Electric Mobility, and two, you have the National Board for the Electric Mobility. The National Board for the Electric Mobility is led by the Secretary Department of Heavy Industries, and its main mandate is to recommend various policies which can be taken in order to push for the electric mobility. Once these policies are recommended, these policies are then forwarded to the National Council for the Electric Mobility. The National Council of Electric Mobility is headed by the Minister for the Heavy Industries. So please do note here that the National Council for the Electric Mobility, it is not headed by the Prime Minister, rather it is headed by the Minister of Heavy Industries, and its main mandate is to approve those policies which have been recommended by the National Board for the Electric Mobility. And as highlighted before, both National Council of Electric Mobility and National Board for Electric Mobility have been set up under the National Electric Mobility Mission Plan 2020. Now coming to the most important initiative, that is the FAME scheme. The FAME here stands for Faster Adoption and Manufacturing of Hybrid and Electric Vehicles scheme. This scheme is presently implemented by the Ministry for Heavy Industries. See, if you have to adopt the electric mobility, there are basically two constraints. One, the cost of electric vehicles is much higher in comparison to the conventional vehicles. Second, when you buy an electric vehicle, you need the charging infrastructure. So basically, the FAME scheme has been designed in order to address these two constraints faced in the adoption of electric mobility. First and foremost, in order to reduce the initial cost of electric vehicles, the FAME scheme provides for a demand incentive. Now, this demand incentive is provided in the form of the upfront reduced purchasing price of an electric vehicle. Now, for example, let's say the cost of an electric two-wheeler is approximately around 1 lakh. Obviously, this is costlier in comparison to a conventional two-wheeler vehicle. So the government here would provide for a demand incentive. This demand incentive is provided in the form of the reduced purchasing price of this particular electric two-wheeler. For example, the price of this electric two-wheeler can be reduced by an X amount. Let's say in this particular case, this X amount is around rupees 30,000. Now what this means is when you're buying this electric two-wheeler, you'll not be required to pay the entire 1 lakh rupees. Instead, you'll be required to pay only 70,000 rupees to the concerned dealer. As far as the remaining 30,000 is concerned, this remaining 30,000 would be paid by the government on your behalf to the dealer. So when you buy an electric vehicle, you will not be required to pay the entire market price. The market price of an electric vehicle would be reduced by a certain X amount, and this X amount is the incentive which the government gives to the consumers on buying of the electric vehicles. Now the question is, on which all categories of electric vehicles can we get this demand incentive? Now, this demand incentive is applicable on electric two-wheelers, electric three-wheelers, electric four-wheelers, as well as the electric buses. But as far as the electric three-wheelers, electric four-wheelers and electric buses is concerned, this demand incentive is available only on the vehicles which are used for the public transportation or the vehicles which are registered as the commercial vehicles. So for the vehicles which are registered as the private vehicles, for them the demand incentive is not available. Now let me give an example to simplify this. Now for example, let's say you'd want to buy an electric four-wheeler for your own personal use. In that particular case, the demand incentive will not be available. But if you want to buy an electric four-wheeler to be used for commercial purpose, let's say you would want to use an electric four-wheeler as a cab, which is a commercial vehicle. In this particular case, the demand incentive would be available. So please do make a note here that for the electric three-wheelers, four-wheelers and electric buses, the demand incentive is available for the vehicles which are used for the public transportation or registered as a commercial vehicles. The demand incentive is not available for the private vehicles. As far as the electric two-wheelers is concerned, here the demand incentive is available for the private electric two-wheeler vehicles. So for example, if you want to buy the Ola scooter for your own personal use, you would be able to get the demand incentive under the FAME scheme. Now coming to the next question as to how much of demand incentive would the consumer get? That is, as I explained here, the purchasing price of an electric vehicle is reduced by an X amount. So what factor would determine this X amount? So the amount of demand incentive in turn depends upon the battery capacity of an electric vehicle. So it means that higher the battery capacity, higher would be the demand incentive. Now for example, in case of the electric two-wheelers, the demand incentive has been fixed at, for every 1 kilowatt hour, the demand incentive is fixed at rupees 20,000. So for every 1 kilowatt hour, you would get a demand incentive of rupees 20,000. So for example, if an electric two-wheeler has a battery capacity of 2 kilowatt hour, the demand incentive which you would get in this particular case would be rupees 40,000. Similarly, if the battery capacity is 3 kilowatt hour, the demand incentive would be rupees 60,000. Thirdly, the government also fixes a cap on how much of demand incentive can be given for a particular electric vehicle. Now, this particular limit on the demand incentive is in turn dependent upon the cost of an electric vehicle. Now, for example, in case of the electric two-wheelers, the cap or the limit on the demand incentive right now is 40% of the cost of the electric vehicle. Now, for example, if the cost of an electric two-wheeler is say rupees 2 lakh, then the maximum amount of demand incentive that you would be able to get for this electric vehicle, 40% of rupees 2 lakh, that is rupees 80,000. So beyond rupees 80,000, you will not be able to get the demand incentive. As highlighted at the start of the discussion, the government has made certain important changes in the FAME scheme, in order to make the electric mobility more attractive. Now, these changes have been made specifically with respect to the electric two-wheelers. The first change is with respect to the increase in the demand incentive for the electric two-wheelers. Earlier, this demand incentive was fixed at rupees 10,000 per kilowatt hour. Now, from rupees 10,000 per kilowatt hour, the demand incentive has now increased to rupees 20,000 per kilowatt hour. Secondly, the government has also decided to increase the cap on the demand incentive on the electric two-wheelers. Earlier, it was fixed at 20% of the cost of electric vehicle. From 20% of the cost of electric vehicle, now the limit on the demand incentive has increased to 40% of the cost of electric vehicles. So these changes have been made in order to make the electric mobility, particularly the electric two-wheelers, more attractive for the Indian consumers. Apart from all of these initiatives, recently the government of India has decided to launch the production linked incentive scheme for the automobile sector. Through the production linked incentive scheme, the government seeks to incentivize the production of the electric vehicles in India. Now coming to various constraints and challenges with respect to electric mobility in India. See, under the FAME2 scheme, we have so far allocated approximately around rupees 10,000 crores to be provided in the form of demand incentive to the people. But you'll be surprised to know that out of these 10,000 crores, so far we have been able to utilize only around rupees 225 crores. So clearly, India is not yet fully ready for the adoption of electric mobility. There are certain constraints and challenges. First and foremost, in spite of various government's incentives which are provided under the FAME2 scheme, the penetration of electric vehicles in case of India has remained quite lower at below 1%. Whereas in case of China, the penetration of electric vehicles is as high as around 12%. Whereas in some of the countries such as Norway, the electric vehicles constitute approximately around 40% of their overall vehicle fleet. The second constraint is with respect to the charging infrastructure. Undoubtedly, under the FAME2 scheme, we have been able to expand the charging infrastructure, particularly in the metropolitan cities such as Delhi, Mumbai, etc. However, even today, the charging infrastructure continues to remain poor, particularly in the Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities. Apart from the lack of availability of the charging infrastructure, another constraint is with respect to the time taken to fully charge an electric vehicle. Now, for example, if you would want to fully charge a Tata Nexon electric vehicle through a standard charger, it would approximately take around 10 to 12 hours, which can act as a disincentive for the people from buying the electric vehicles. Obviously, we do have the fast chargers which can fully charge an electric vehicle in say around 1 to 2 hours. But once again, we do not have adequate amount of the fast chargers in India. The next constraint is with respect to the efficiency of the electric vehicles, which in turn disincentivizes the people from buying the electric vehicles. Now, for example, once an electric vehicle is fully charged, the amount of distance that it can travel is quite lower. For example, the maximum distance that an electric car can travel when it is fully charged, it is approximately around 250 to 300 km. Because of which the electric vehicles as such can be used more within the limits of the city. On the other hand, if you want to use electric vehicles outside the city to travel from one city to another, we need to install the charging infrastructure, particularly along the national highways. The next constraint is with respect to the speed of the electric vehicles, which is little lower in comparison to the conventional vehicles. And third and most important aspect is the high initial cost. So electric vehicles are considered to be much costlier in comparison to the conventional vehicles. Now, for example, when you look at the Ola scooter, after availing the benefits under the FAME2 scheme, the cost of this Ola scooter is still higher at rupees 1 lakh. Similarly, if you look at the cost of a Tata Nexon electric vehicle in case of Delhi, the on-road price comes to be approximately around rupees 14 to 15 lakhs. In comparison, the petrol version of Tata Nexon, its price, on-road price, is somewhere around rupees 8 to 9 lakhs. So obviously the higher initial cost of the electric vehicles acts as a disincentive for the people from buying the electric vehicles. The next aspect is with respect to the energy insecurity. See, one of the major benefits with respect to push for the electric mobility is that it will help us ensure the energy security. This is so because by giving a push to the electric mobility, the need to import the crude oil would reduce, and this will in turn ensure the energy security for India. But on the other hand, some of the experts have pointed out that India's push for electric mobility can actually lead to energy insecurity. This is so because if you have to manufacture the batteries, we need the raw materials, particularly the rare earth minerals such as lithium, cobalt, etc. India does not have adequate reserves of the rare earth minerals. It is basically dependent upon the import of the rare earth minerals from countries such as China, South American countries such as Argentina, and so on. This is the first aspect. The second aspect is, see, once we start giving a push to the electric mobility, obviously we would have to generate huge amount of electricity to charge the electric vehicles. Now in case of India, almost around 67% of the electricity is basically generated from the fossil fuels, that is coal, oil, etc. So once again, if you have to generate so much of electricity, you would have to import more of crude oil, more of coal, and this can in turn lead to the energy insecurity. And the last constraint is with respect to lack of skilled manpower, particularly with respect to the manufacturing of the electric and hybrid vehicles. So the question is, how do you address these constraints and challenges? Let us look into these aspects. The first strategy is to revisit the FAME scheme in order to make it more suitable for the Indian conditions. Now, if you look at the FAME 2 scheme, under the FAME 2 scheme, we are giving the demand incentive based upon the battery capacity. So higher the battery capacity, higher is the demand incentive. So because of this, the electric four-wheelers, they get more amount of incentives in comparison to the electric two-wheelers. The logic is quite simple here. This is so because the battery capacity of four-wheelers is more than the battery capacity of two-wheelers, because of which the demand incentive for the electric four-wheelers is higher than the demand incentive for the electric two-wheelers. But we must realize that India has a unique mobility pattern. In case of the developed economies, the four-wheelers are much more in demand in comparison to the two-wheelers. But India has a unique mobility pattern wherein the demand for the two-wheelers is much higher than the four-wheelers. So unlike in other countries where their vehicle fleet is dominated by four-wheelers, in case of India, we have a unique mobility pattern wherein our vehicle fleet is dominated by the two-wheelers. So some of the experts have pointed out that if we have to give a push to the electric mobility, we would have to give more amount of incentives for the two-wheelers in comparison to the four-wheelers. And to a certain extent, these concerns have been addressed through the recent changes to the FAME 2 scheme. So as discussed, recently the government has made changes to the FAME 2 scheme, wherein the government has decided to increase the demand incentive as well as the limit on the demand incentive for the electric two-wheelers. So these constraints have been addressed to a certain extent. The second strategy is with respect to encouraging the battery swapping. So what is this concept of battery swapping? Now let's say you have a fully charged battery, because of which your electric vehicle can run for a distance of approximately around 250 to 300 km. So when the battery is going to get discharged, first and foremost, you would have to look out for the nearby charging infrastructure, and secondly, you would have to spend substantial amount of time in charging the battery. So in order to address these two constraints, what we have is the concept of battery swapping. So under the battery swapping, you have a fully charged battery. You use a fully charged battery until the time it is going to get discharged. So once this battery is going to get discharged, you can swap this discharged battery with a fully charged battery. So this swapping of discharged batteries with the fully charged batteries can take place at the charging infrastructure that are being maintained by the private sector entities. So just like how you have the petrol pumps wherein you can refuel your vehicles, we need to have the charging infrastructure maintained by the private sector entities, and such private sector entities should provide the service of the battery swapping. The next strategy is with respect to retrofitting of the existing vehicle fleet. See, in case of India, we have a large number of petrol vehicles which run both on petrol as well as CNG. Similar to that, we need to have a large number of hybrid vehicles which can run both on petrol as well as electric batteries. So we need to have a large number of hybrid vehicles, not just purely electric vehicles. Now, for example, we have a large number of commercial vehicles in India, such as the Uber cabs, Ola cabs, and etc. These cabs can be turned into hybrid vehicles wherein they can run both on petrol as well as the electric batteries. Nextly, as discussed before, we need to improve the charging infrastructure, particularly at bus stands, parking spaces, office spaces, petrol pumps, and so on. Nextly, the government of India has set up KABIL in order to ensure mineral and energy security for India. KABIL stands for Khanij Bidesh India Limited. The main mandate of KABIL is to enter into agreements with such countries which are rich in strategic and critical minerals such as lithium, cobalt, etc. So KABIL would enter into agreement with such countries and then undertake joint exploration and mining of such minerals. Now, for example, recently KABIL has signed an agreement with Argentina for the joint exploration of lithium. So going forward, we need to ensure the success of KABIL in order to ensure the energy security. Similarly, we need to give a more amount of push for the renewable energy in order to address the problem of generation of electricity. Nextly, we need to come up with the innovative incentives in order to encourage the people to adopt the electric mobility. These incentives could include free toll for the electric vehicles, free parking for the electric vehicles. Similarly, some of the state governments such as Delhi, Maharashtra, etc. have decided to give a rebate on the road tax on buying of electric vehicles. So going forward, even other states need to come forward with such incentives in order to encourage the people to adopt the electric mobility. And lastly, people need to be informed, educated, and made aware of various benefits associated with the adoption of electric mobility. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article. Now, based upon our discussion, you can attempt these two prelims questions for the practice and let us know the answer in the comment section given below. Let us now take up the next article. Now, this particular article appears as a lead article on page number 6. This article is written by the Member of Parliament, Mr. Shashi Tharoor, who has written a number of books on international relations, including the famous book that is Pax Indica. In this particular article, Mr. Shashi Tharoor examines the dynamic relationship between India and China. In particular, he has focused upon three distinct dimensions. First and foremost, he has highlighted about China's grand strategy towards the resolution of border disputes. In particular, he has discussed as to how China has been shifting the line of actual control in its own favor, how China's grand strategy in the resolution of border disputes has affected India, and what are India's options. In particular, he has discussed the problems with respect to the economic boycott of China by India. So let us first look at China's grand strategy towards the resolution of border disputes and how it has affected India. China's strategy towards a border dispute is basically twofold. First and foremost, China chooses a point or multiple points along the line of actual control where it would want to escalate the border disputes. Usually the points which China chooses are the points where the border is well settled and hence it is not contested by either countries. For example, in recent times, China has initiated the border dispute over both Doklam as well as Galwan Valley. Now, if you look at both of these two areas were well settled and they are not contested by China so far. So initially, China initiates a border dispute, particularly over a region or a point which is well settled and not contested by it earlier. So once a border dispute is initiated, China it substantially increases its troop presence and after certain duration of time, it agrees for disengagement. So the question which arises is, if China is finally agreeing to disengage its troops, then why did it initiate the border dispute in the first place itself? Now, in order to decipher this, we have to understand as to how the troop position along the line of actual control changes during the different stages of border dispute. That is the troop position before the border standoff, the troop position during the border standoff, and the troop position after the border standoff, that is after the process of disengagement. Now let's say there is a particular region along the line of actual control and the LAC as such is mutually agreed by both the countries. Let's say at this particular place we have the Indian troops, and at this particular place you have the Chinese troops, and both Indian troops as well as the Chinese troops are patrolling up to the line of actual control. This is basically done in order to ensure that either of these two countries do not cross the line of actual control. Now this is a troop position before the border standoff. Now what happens during the border standoff is China deliberately introduces a new flashpoint along the line of actual control. So it chooses a new location along the line of actual control. It starts claiming that the new region belongs to China, and in order to press forward its border claims, it substantially increases its troop presence in the region. So as you can see here, China is trying to unilaterally change the line of actual control. At the same time, the Chinese troops would also prevent the Indian army from carrying out the patrolling in the region. Now this has happened in both Galwan Valley as well as the Doklam Plateau. Now after the border tensions reach to a certain point, China then agrees for disengaging its troops. So what exactly do you mean by disengagement? Of troops basically has three facets. First and foremost, both India and China decide to pull back their troops from the disputed region. Secondly, they would agree to create a buffer zone. And thirdly, both these countries would decide to suspend the patrolling in the region. Now, as you can see here, prior to the border standoff, Chinese troops were far away from the line of actual control. But now, after the process of disengagement, in a way the Chinese army has moved much closer to the line of actual control. So what has actually happened here is that the Chinese troops has moved ahead by 2 steps, but after the border standoff, it has moved backward only by 1 step. So because of these 2 forward steps and 1 backward step, China as such has moved much closer to the line of actual control. So this is the first problem. The second problem here is, if you look at this particular region as such, this region was never contested by China, and it was in this particular region Indian troops used to carry out patrolling in order to ensure that the Chinese army do not cross over the line of actual control. But what has happened after this disengagement is that India has decided not to carry out patrolling in this region. See, we have to agree to the fact that the process of disengagement between India and China has undoubtedly led to peace and tranquility along the line of actual control, at least in the short run. But at the same time, we have to ensure that China does not permanently establish its presence in the region. Overall, in order to summarize China's grand strategy over the border dispute with India, first and foremost, China starts a new face-off at a new location. After that, it builds up its troops presence in the region. Then after a certain duration of time, it starts withdrawing its troops and agree to a process of disengagement. Even though it vacates the flashpoint, but it establishes a very strong and permanent presence in the nearby areas. So far we have discussed as to how China has been shifting the line of actual control in its own favor. So what is China's long-term plan according to Mr. Shashi Tharoor? China's long-term plan can be broken down into 3 distinct dimensions. First and foremost, China keeps telling to India that the border disputes should not affect our bilateral relationship. It keeps telling to India that the border disputes can be solved by the future generations as and when the time is right. And until that happens, the border disputes as such should not adversely affect our bilateral relationship. So this is the first thing what China does. Secondly, by highlighting that the border disputes should not affect our bilateral relationship, China seeks India's support on various issues which matter to both the countries. Now, for example, both India and China, they both are developing countries. So they share similar interests and concerns on number of issues. Some of these issues include the reforms in the IMF, particularly the quota reforms. Then they share similar concerns and interests in various WTO agreements. So in all these issues, China seeks India's support. At the same time, China keeps highlighting that the 21st century is a century of India as well as China. So what China is basically saying is we need to ignore the border disputes, and as long as India and China have certain common interests, certain common concerns, we need to cooperate on such issues. So far, so good. But instead of maintaining peace and tranquility along the line of actual control, instead of allowing the border disputes to be solved by the future generations, what China keeps doing is China keeps shifting the line of actual control in its own favor. More importantly, it keeps shifting the line of actual control slowly and gradually without starting a full-fledged war. It chooses a flashpoint along the line of actual control, and this flashpoint would be that point along the line of actual control which is actually well settled. So once it initiates a border dispute, slowly the border disputes escalates, then it builds up the troops along the border, and as discussed before, it keeps on shifting the line of actual control in its own favor. So in the long run, that is over a period of time, China would grow both in terms of economy as well as in terms of military. And by doing that, it will keep on shifting the line of actual control in its own favor. So this is what is China's long-term plan with respect to the border dispute which it has with India. So what are India's options to deal with China's long-term plan? First and foremost, in terms of diplomatic engagement, we have been having regular talks with Chinese officials as well as military personnel in order to ease the tensions along the line of actual control. Secondly, we have also built up our Indian troops presence along the line of actual control. But so far, these two options have not yielded the necessary results. Apart from these two options, India has also exercised the option of economic boycott of China. Now, for example, we have decided to boycott the Chinese goods, wherein we have decided to impose a higher customs duty on the Chinese goods. This is basically done in order to reduce India's trade deficit with China, which was as high as $60 billion in the year 2018-19. The FDI norms have been made more stringent in order to make it more difficult for the Chinese companies to invest in India. We have started the Vocal for Local campaign in order to encourage the people to buy more of Indian goods and boycott the Chinese goods. The government of India has also undertaken a digital strike wherein the Indian government has banned approximately around 59 Chinese apps such as TikTok, UC browser, etc. But there are certain challenges and constraints with respect to the economic boycott of China. First and foremost, if we economically boycott the Chinese goods or the Chinese companies, it will have a minimal impact on the Chinese economy. This is so because India accounts only for 3.1% of the Chinese exports. Similarly, China's FDI into India is hardly around $2.3 billion out of the total 50 billion FDI which India receives on an annual basis. So even if you boycott the Chinese goods or the Chinese companies, it will have a minimal impact on the Chinese economy. If India stops importing the Chinese goods, China can very well export the goods to other countries, let's say the African countries. So the economic boycott of China, according to some of the experts, has a minimal impact on the Chinese economy. But at the same time, the economic boycott of China would have a much larger impact on the Indian economy. This is so because India is majorly dependent on China for a number of materials such as electronic goods, capital machinery, active pharmaceutical ingredients in the pharmaceutical sector, automotive parts, fertilizers, etc. So if we increase the custom duty on the raw materials that we import from China, this would have an adverse impact on the domestic manufacturing, and this can also lead to loss of jobs. Now, for example, if you look at the active pharmaceutical ingredients, which are the raw materials in the pharmaceutical industry, we import almost around 70% of our active pharmaceutical ingredients from China. So if we keep increasing the custom duty on these raw materials, this would have an adverse impact on our pharmaceutical industry. So obviously there are a number of challenges and constraints with respect to economic boycott of China. So, with respect to third option, there are certain concerns and challenges. Accordingly, Mr. Shashi Tharoor highlights that China's long-term plan may force India to exercise the fourth option, which it has been reluctant to do so. What is this fourth option? That is to align itself with the Western powers. So far, India has not openly aligned with the Western powers as an anti-China strategy. Yes, we have become part of the Quad, but India once again keeps saying that it is not a strategy to contain China. So accordingly, Mr. Shashi Tharoor highlights that if China keeps on pursuing its long-term plan, it may pressurize or force India to align itself with the Western powers, which it has been reluctant to do so far. So this is what you must understand from the perspective of this particular article. Now the next article appears on page number 12. The title of the article is US, UK, Australia form the new partnership. This article shall be important mainly with respect to prelims under the subsection of international relations. Now we all know that China has become highly assertive in the Indo-Pacific region. China has claimed the entire South China Sea to itself. China has also substantially increased its investment in the Indo-Pacific region. So the growing presence of China has in turn threatened the peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. Accordingly, some of the like-minded countries such as US, Australia, India, Japan, they have come together to form the Quad grouping. Similar to this particular grouping, recently US, Australia and UK have come together to form a Trilateral Security Partnership Agreement known as the AUKUS. So AUKUS here can be considered to be a form of grouping that will complement the efforts of Quad in ensuring peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. The need for AUKUS arises from the fact that previously Australia used to maintain good relations with China. But in the recent years, the tensions between these two countries has been increasing because of the growing assertiveness of China in the Indo-Pacific region. Similarly, the tensions between China and the Western powers led by US has also increased. So the basic idea behind the forming of this particular grouping is to counter the growing presence of China in the Indo-Pacific region. As part of this particular grouping, the idea here is both US as well as UK will help Australia to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. Now, these nuclear-powered submarines are considered to be more quieter and more capable in comparison to the conventional submarines, because of which they can be deployed for the longer periods in the Indo-Pacific region. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article from the perspective of the prelims examination. Now the next article appears on page number 10. Now this particular article highlights that the Drug Controller General of India has recently given the nod for the phase 3 clinical trial of the Sputnik Light vaccine. Now all the aspects related to the Sputnik Light vaccine have been discussed by me in the DNS dated 7th of May 2021. So in case if any of you have not gone through this particular DNS, please go through this particular DNS in order to understand all the aspects related to the working mechanism of the Sputnik Light vaccine. The link to this particular DNS has been given in the description box below. With this, we have come to the end of today's discussion. The answer to the question that was asked in yesterday's DNS is option B.